It was the middle of the night, and the aircraft was cruising at 39,000 feet right above the Atlantic Ocean. This was a situation pilots face every day. Nothing seemed abnormal. But there was one thing on that aircraft that was about to change everything within a matter of minutes. Let us tell you that at 39,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, there's no land in sight for miles and miles. Suddenly, the captain realized the aircraft was about to run out of fuel. For both pilots, this was a horrifying situation, because running out of fuel above the Atlantic Ocean usually means only one thing: death. This incident occurred on August the 23rd, 2001. At Toronto Pearson Airport, Air Transat's Airbus A330 was being prepared for a flight to Lisbon. It was supposed to be a 7-hour non-stop flight, and so 48 metric tons of fuel were loaded into the plane. After preparations were complete, the boarding process began. At this time, it was 9 p.m. local time. Flight 236 had 293 passengers on board, along with 13 crew members, including 2 pilots. The flight captain was 48-year-old Robert Pichet, with 16,000 hours of flight experience. The first officer was 28-year-old Dirk de Jager, who had 5,000 hours of experience, 400 of which were on the Airbus A330. As for the aircraft, it was a state-of-the-art Airbus A330 model, only 2 years old. So there was no lack of experience in the cockpit, and there was no fault in the aircraft itself. After completing all flight checks, the pilots taxied Flight 236 to the runway and took off with ATC clearance. After takeoff, the pilots set course across the Atlantic toward Lisbon. Within minutes, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. On such long flights, pilots generally don't have much to do since the autopilot handles most of the flying. They mainly monitor the situation and report their location and updates to air traffic control. 4 hours had passed since takeoff. Everything was running smoothly, and most passengers were asleep due to the late hour. The aircraft had reached the center of the Atlantic Ocean, and that was the moment when the problem began. At 1 a.m. Canadian time, the pilot noticed an abnormal reading in engine number 2, the right engine. It was showing high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low oil temperature. This was the first time the pilots had ever encountered such an error in their careers. They immediately opened the flight manual and tried to find information about this strange error. Normally, when an aircraft is in operation, oil temperature increases over time. But here it was showing low oil temperature, which was not normal in any way. They couldn't find any reference to this error in the manual. The pilots contacted Air Transat's maintenance unit in Canada and informed them of the issue. Unfortunately, the maintenance team also didn't have any information about this error. They told the pilots to continue monitoring the situation and said they would get back in touch soon. Although the right engine was showing faulty oil readings, the aircraft's performance wasn't affected. The pilots relaxed, thinking it might just be a faulty sensor giving incorrect readings. But half an hour later, another advisory message popped up on the captain's screen. This time, it wasn't related to oil, but to fuel. In commercial airliners, fuel is usually evenly distributed between the wings, but it was noted that the right wing had less fuel compared to the left wing. Now, normally this isn't a serious problem either because it can be fixed mid-flight. The captain opened the cross-feed valve to transfer fuel from the left wing to the right wing. Within minutes, the fuel levels in both wings were equal again. Just 10 minutes later, the captain started receiving low fuel warnings. This was a terrifying issue no pilot wants to face, especially in a plane full of passengers. The pilot noticed that the right wing again had low fuel, and even when combining both wings, there still wasn't enough fuel to reach Lisbon. Now the situation had become serious. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there weren't many diversion options. In reality, they had only one option: the Azores Islands. These islands are part of Portuguese territory in the Atlantic Ocean, where the island of Terceira has an airport. The captain immediately contacted Santa Maria ATC and informed them that they were diverting to that airport due to a fuel shortage. But even then, the pilots weren't sure whether they could make it to the airport or would be forced to ditch into the ocean. At that moment, the aircraft had about 7 tons of fuel left, roughly 7,000 kilograms. It might sound like a lot, but in reality, this was just 6% of the A330's fuel capacity, and it was decreasing rapidly. But the real question was, why was the fuel decreasing? Was it another faulty sensor giving incorrect readings? Or was there actually a fuel leak? The only way fuel could drop like this was if it was leaking somewhere. To confirm, the captain instructed the flight crew to go inspect the trailing edge of the wings, the rear part of the wing. If there was a leak, it would be visible from there. At that point, the aircraft was losing 1 ton of fuel every 5 minutes. It was now clear to the captain that there was indeed a fuel leak somewhere. Only about 25 minutes of fuel remained, barely enough to reach Terceira Airport. Meanwhile, the captain and first officer stayed in constant contact with the maintenance unit and ATC. The maintenance team instructed the captain to descend from 39,000 to 20,000 feet to verify the leak, but the captain refused to do so. Then all doubts were erased when flames erupted from the right engine. Panic broke out in the aircraft. Passengers who had been peacefully sleeping were now cloaked in the shadow of fear. The aircraft now had only 4 tons of fuel and just 1 engine remaining. Cruising on a single engine wasn't possible anymore, and the aircraft began to slowly descend. On the other side, emergency had been declared at Terceira Airport. Fire trucks and emergency crews began preparing for any possible outcome. The aircraft, which was still 240 kilometers away from the airport, now had only 600 kilograms of fuel left. And then the worst happened. The left engine, which was running at full thrust, also gave out. Now, Flight 236 was gliding above the Atlantic Ocean with no engines. At this point, the captain's earlier decision to not descend to 20,000 feet proved to be absolutely correct. With both engines out, the aircraft went dark, because it's the engines that power the aircraft's electrical systems. Thankfully, the plane's automatic ram air turbine deployed, generating just enough electricity through airspeed to keep essential cockpit instruments running. Now, Terceira Airport was 120 kilometers away. The aircraft had descended to 30,000 feet. The captain had to cover the remaining distance purely by gliding. The passenger cabin was filled with darkness and a pin-drop silence, a chilling atmosphere hinting at imminent disaster. The worst-case scenario: if the aircraft couldn't make it to the airport, it would have to ditch in the ocean. The crew began preparing passengers for a water landing. Ditching into the ocean is extremely dangerous. If passengers survived the impact, they could still drown. And if they didn't drown, they could die from hypothermia in the freezing water. Now, gliding a passenger aircraft without engines is very difficult. Everything depended on pitch control, which the pilot was now handling manually with the control stick. The aircraft was descending at a rate of 2,000 feet per minute. That meant it had about 15 minutes left, either to make it to the airport or end up in the ocean. At 15 kilometers from the airport, the aircraft was still at 13,000 feet. Normally, aircraft should be at 3,000 feet at that distance. If the pilot dived the nose to lose altitude, the speed would increase dramatically, making crash landing highly likely. So instead, the pilot made the aircraft do a full 360-degree turn. After the turn, the distance remained the same, but the altitude dropped to 5,000 feet. Still a bit high, but not enough for another loop. So, the pilot aligned the plane with the runway and performed a few S-turns. These helped increase the runway distance and bought more time to reduce altitude. Under normal circumstances, flaps are deployed during landing to create drag, and engine thrust is increased to lift the nose. But Flight 236 had no engine thrust. So this landing was nothing like a typical landing. It was dangerous and extremely risky. The pilot had only one shot at landing: do or die. Finally, the aircraft slammed onto the runway with a huge jolt. 8 out of 12 tires burst. The aircraft was difficult to stop, but finally it came to a halt while skidding. As soon as the plane stopped, a fire erupted in the landing gear, which the airport crew quickly brought under control. Flight 236 became the first and only passenger aircraft in aviation history to glide for the longest time without engines. After investigation, it was found that before takeoff in Toronto, maintenance crew had replaced a part in the right engine. But that part belonged to another aircraft. Due to a loose fitting, it caused vibrations that ruptured a nearby fuel line. Following this incident, Airbus installed a new system to detect in-flight fuel leaks. A year later, Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager were honored with a Superior Airmanship Award for performing a dead-stick landing in an Airbus A330. We hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.